And today we have a very interesting presentation by Jan Yassian called ʻAbdu'l-Bahá and the Other, which will be looking at some tablets of Bahá'u'lláh and Abdu'l-Bahá, issues of xenophobia and racism, and related topics, I guess you could say. Jan has had a remarkable, varied life. His parents were from Poland, moving to Canada. He was born in Canada, and he has done, well, I won't say everything under the sun, but my goodness, it gets kind of close. He has been a roofer. He has been a laborer at an iron ore smelter. He's been a librarian or library technician in, I think, 4 different libraries, if I count right, including working at the Baha'i World Center Library. He also worked in the Department of Philosophy at Warsaw University as a cataloger and librarian and an editor. He has been, goodness, what else do we have here? Economic journalist and translator in Warsaw. He returned to Poland as a pioneer. Actually, I think you said before the fall of the Berlin Wall, if I remember right, and was there to help establish the Baha'i community. He also had pioneered to Labrador before that, which was certainly much colder than Poland most of the time. Has served on many national committees, local assemblies, and currently he's an editor at Librairie Baha'i, which is the French Baha'i publishing company in Paris. He currently lives in a Paris suburb with his wife, Annie Joël, and he has published 35 articles in journals in Canada, the United States, the UK, France, and Poland, and Pakistan in a variety of topics. I think the most recent books that he has published, Never Be Afraid to Dare through George Ronald, but then ʻAbdu'l-Bahá in France, which has been published in English and French, ʻAbdu'l-Bahá in the West, English and French, and Tahirih in History, which is a little older as a publication. And he's working on a bio-bibliography of John Esselmont, and that I think will be quite interesting to see as well. So that is my introduction to Jan. Jan, welcome to the Wilmot Institute's webinar series, and thank you so much for participating today. We're looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you very much to Robert and to Boyd for making this happen. The presentation, as Robert said, will be about the Abdu'l-Bahā's visit to North America and the newspaper coverage, particularly the missing newspapers. But since there are 2 themes to this presentation, I would first like to acknowledge the very positive influence of the works of 3 scholars on sensitizing me to the question of racism when I was a young student at Windsor. John Porter from Canada, Gunnar Myrdal, and Abdu'l-Bahá. Without them, my views on this subject would have been minuscule. My research in the field of newspapers and the Baha'i faith could not have been undertaken without the support, questions, and answers from friends around the globe. Too many to name them all here, but a few stand out. Amín Egea in Spain, Stephen Kolins in America, David Merrick in Scotland, Alan Keane in Ireland, Frederic Autré and Armindo Pedro in France. The bibliographic notes of many scholars were used as guides and at times as foils, and I thank them all. The presentation will be in 5 parts. We will look first at what is xenophobia, Abdu'l-Bahā's response to it, his interaction with certain newspapers, the impact of xenophobia on newspaper collections, and we will conclude by examining a few comments by Bahá'u'lláh on newspapers and writers. But first, we will look at the ravages of the other pandemic, which has encircled the globe and is still laying waste its cities as I speak. The name of this virulent disease is xenophobia. It is defined variously as a dislike, shunning, and hating of the other. It has many strains, which flare up and dominate some regions for some time, are suppressed only to be replaced by a new strain. Currently, the strains that are dominating in America are racism, Hispanophobia, Islamophobia, with anti-Semitism lurking in the corner. There are dozens of other strains. This virus is vicious, devious, and insidious. It aims to divide and conquer. It divides the victims and unites the oppressors. Number 1 document, xenophobia. Boyd, could you read it for me, please? It would be much easier in my throat.
Sure. So some comments on xenophobia. Number 1, it is wrong, i.e. immoral and untruthful. Number 2, it is stupid, i.e. lacking in normal intelligence. Number 3, it is a disease which is highly contagious and insidious. A, it is irrational. B, it is bereft of logic. C, it encourages A and B to be argued to show that both are rational and logical. D, it is divisive in that it tends to divide the victims one against the other. E, it victimizes the victims by encouraging the victims to blame themselves for their plight. F, it encourages the victims to suppress their objectionable traits and pass for white. G, it denies the spiritual reality of the oneness of mankind. H, its existence is a denial of the biological unity of mankind. I, it helps to unite oppressors and tyrants. J, it disrespects and distorts the culture of the other and then rationalizes the argument. K, it distorts and deforms language to facilitate its existence. For one example, the use of lowercase initial letter in a name of a nationality or ethnic group is considered demeaning and disrespectful. But the use of black as another term for African American is common, rather than the correct term black, those differentiated by large uppercase and lowercase, for those who are just listening. Another word, racism, could be argued is an oxymoron since there is only but one human race, and therefore the only inhabitants who could be racist are Martians and Venusians.
Thank you, Boyd. For this presentation, please remember points C and J of the above. When Abdu'l-Bahá made his Western tour, in his first published talk given in Paris on October 16th, 1911, he said in part, "I ask you not to think of yourselves. Be kind to the stranger, whether they come from Turkey, Japan, Persia, Russia, China, or any other country in the world." Could you please read that too, Boyd? Thank you.
My pleasure. Abdu'l-Bahá, Paris, October 16th, 1911. When a man turns his face to God, he finds sunshine everywhere. All men are his brothers. Let not conventionality cause you to seem cold and unsympathetic when you meet strange people from other countries. Do not look at them as though you suspected them of being evildoers, thieves, and boors. You think it necessary to be very careful not to expose yourselves to the risk of making acquaintance with such possibly undesirable people. I ask you not to think only of yourselves. Be kind to the strangers, whether they come from Turkey, Japan, Persia, Russia, China, or any other country in the world. Help to make them feel at home. Find out where they are staying. Ask if you may render them any service. Try to make their lives a little happier. In this way, even if sometimes what you at first suspected should be true, still go out of your way to be kind to them. This kindness will help them to become better. After all, why should any foreign people be treated as strangers? Let those who meet you know without your proclaiming the fact that you are indeed a Baha'i.
Thank you. This is one of his themes that he elucidated in many of the cities he visited in America. The list of peoples that he mentioned as victims of xenophobic acts is long, and besides those already mentioned include the African Americans, the Jews, the Indians or First Native Nation peoples, and others. Not only did he talk about inclusivity, but he practiced it. He went to the meeting places and the homes of the Black Americans. the Armenians, the Syrians, the Greeks, the Jews, the East Indians, the Japanese, and other groups. We know the story with Louis Gregory at the Washington banquet, but there are other lesser-known stories, such as the meeting with the Black servants at the Parsons Boathouse in Dublin, New Hampshire, the visit to the home of Charles Tinsley, a Black servant from the Hearst estate who had broken his leg, lunch with ladies of the left bank in Paris, the sudden change of hotels in Paris after a Black seeker had been refused entry, his sudden enthusiasm of meeting with the Greeks in a park in New York City, despite a very uncomfortable ride on the Underground Metro, his seeking out a meeting under the Eiffel Tower for the second time, a crippled seller of postcards confined to a wheelchair, etc. There are many, many such examples. Abdu'l-Bahá and xenophobia. Boyd, could you please?
Abdu'l-Bahá confronted the following strains of xenophobia: racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, homophobia, Hiberniaphobia, ugly American syndrome, Francophobia, anti-feminism, Japanophobia, Germanophobia, Turcophobia, Italiophobia, ethnic and racial stereotypes, disability discrimination.
That was a short list. Now we'll look at the press coverage during Abdu'l-Bahá's ministry. There were 4 periods during Abdu'l-Bahá's ministry where there was intense press coverage. 1896, associated with the assassination of the Shah of Persia. 1903, when there were intense and bloody persecutions of the Bahá'ís in Persia. 1911 to 1913, his travels in the West. 1921 to 1922, the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá. Abdu'l-Bahá's trip to America in 1912 was widely covered in the newspapers. His every movement, talk, and engagement was recorded within about 2,000 articles. My friend Amín Egea has done a remarkable presentation in his 2-volume, The Apostle of Peace, a survey of references to Abdu'l-Bahá in the Western press, published by George Ronald in 2018. In the United States, Abdu'l-Bahá met a variety of minority communities. Notable are his engagements with the African Americans at Howard University and at the NAACP convention in Chicago. These were well covered by the Black press, both local and national. However, the story is quite different with his meetings with the other groups. The Armenians. On July 21st, 1912, the Armenian Federation Society had a memorial service to which Abdu'l-Bahá was invited and at which he spoke. But the only newspaper account we have is from the New York Tribune and possibly the New York Herald. Mahmoud Zarqani reports that this talk was not recorded by the Persians. I wonder what the Armenians themselves wrote about the meeting. The Library of Congress lists 28 Armenian periodicals published in America in its collection, none of which have been digitalized. And I should mention that it's the digitalized newspapers which are the focus, because they're the ones which are publicly available. We're not looking at the newspapers secluded in library archives. The Syrians and Lebanese. He met with the Syrian community, which also included the Lebanese at that time, in Boston twice, in May and July. Here, we are dependent on the English language Boston Herald for a report, but only for the second meeting. Since Abdu'l-Bahá spoke in Arabic, there was no translation and no recording, except in the Arabic press, for which we have no report. although Amín does give us the reference to the periodical Al-Saih. That's AL-SAIH. It is available at the Library of Congress, but only on microfilm. Apparently, this was a highly literate gathering with poets, writers, and editors of the Syrian American community. Khalil Gibran was a member of this society. Abdu'l-Bahá, I should mention that Abdu'l-Bahá is very pleased with the reports from the Arabic newspapers. The Japanese. He had several meetings with the Japanese in California. He even gave his permission for articles to be published in the Japanese press. By the very fact that he gave his permission, he became an active partner in this endeavor. These are also missing from our collective knowledge. The Jewish community. Abdu'l-Bahá visited several synagogues, and the reporting in the press was widespread. And it would be interesting to see what the response was in the Yiddish press. Some of the American Yiddish newspapers have been digitalized and are available, but not in America. However, Ahmad Sorab reports the reporting in the Arabic press of his meeting at the synagogue in San Francisco was of such a high quality that Abdu'l-Bahá instructed that 50 packets of newspapers be made up for his journey back to Egypt. Since these newspapers have not been digitalized, the information is not publicly available. To summarize, we have no public access to Abdu'l-Bahá's talks to the Armenians, Syrians, and Japanese, solely on the grounds that they were recorded neither in Persian nor English. Besides the talks themselves, the commentaries by the journalists and editors would also be of interest, especially in the Yiddish press. Also, what would be of interest would be the echo in the Hungarian diaspora, because Abdu'l-Bahā's trip to Budapest was highly publicized. He was lionized by the Hungarian press. Around 30 articles appeared in Budapest. So there would have been an echo in the Hungarian press in America if we could ever find those newspapers. Amín Egea states in his introduction, quote, "Much more research is yet to be conducted in American journals and magazines, especially in the many newspapers published in different ethnic and cultural communities in the United States. As far as I'm aware, he is the first to acknowledge this gap in our collective history. From all the digital sources at my disposal, I have been able to locate for the year 1912 one article in each of the following ethnic language newspapers: Polish, German, Dutch, and 3 in Czech. Added to this are 2 articles from the Jewish, 2 from the Irish, and 1 from the Japanese English language newspapers and magazines. Remember that the number of foreign language newspapers was estimated to be in excess of 1,300 in 1910. That is 1,300 foreign language newspapers. And this does not count the large number of English language newspapers in the diaspora communities. I remember when I was working on my book, Abdu'l-Bahá in the West, a biographical guide, I and my friends noticed a lack of articles concerning Abdu'l-Bahá in immigrant press. Only 2 were found, in Polish and Dutch, in all of the various sources at our disposal at the time. Our assumption was that the immigrant communities and the press were not interested in Abdu'l-Bahá, but we were terribly mistaken. Scraps of information from various sources indicate that there was a lively interest in Abdu'l-Bahá in the foreign press. these articles are far and few between, but there is enough of them to indicate that there must be much more. The Library of Libraries in the United States is the Library of Congress. Though not a national library, it has taken up that role as well. Its role in collecting, disseminating information, and establishing standards in the library environment is not to be underestimated. It is also a role model for many other national institutions outside the United States. Now we will look at their role in conserving and digitalizing newspapers in the various and diverse communities in the United States. The first is a list of ethnic communities, and the second is the various language communities represented in the digital collection. Please, Boyd. The slide is up. There's no need to read the mission statement, please, Boyd.
Sure.
Okay.
From the mission statement of the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress presents the cultural output of the United States in all its diversity. Our collections and the materials we present online speak for their creators, not for the library or the United States government. Digitized newspaper titles for special audiences, ethnic communities, available in Chronicling America, published between 1690 to 1963.
Thank you. This is very interesting statement because it seems to be inclusive, all inclusive. So what do we take from it? What is a conclusion of the attitude of the Library of Congress? And as it states, it represents the US government in the fact that the Chinese, Armenians, the Japanese, Dutch, Portuguese, etc., are omitted from the list. That is one problem. Second problem is that the listing of the ethnic communities is wrong since it has Slavic and Yugoslavian. The first is a major language group that uses two scripts for its dozen or so languages, which are not mutually understandable. The largest group being Russian. The second name, Yugoslavian, refers to a former nation composed of at least 6 major ethnic groups and several minor ones. The largest group are the Serbians. Note, both Russian and Serbian are omitted from the language group list. Also on the ethnic group, we have Mexico is listed separate from Latin America, but Puerto Ricans are missing. Yet the Library of Congress has Spanish newspapers from Puerto Rico digitalized. Since Portuguese is missing from the language in the second list, it could be argued that Latin America should have been labeled as Hispanic America to be more accurate. Minor point there. However, Hawaiian is missing from the language group. So in the ethnic group, Pacific Islander probably refers to the English-speaking residents of Hawaii. And this is so indicated on their map, which accompanied the list. Now we go to the languages. So we see the languages that they have digitalized. And we see the languages that are missing. The asterisks are the ones which we have, I have to find my papers here. The asterisks are for the ones that we have newspapers which are referencing the faith, the articles in these language groups. The double asterisk indicates newspapers from the various languages which there are articles on the faith, but which are not in the Library of Congress collection. And then we have a group of languages from Chronicling America, missing from Chronicling America, that we know have been digitalized. These are American newspapers in Dutch, Hawaiian, Welsh, Esperanto, and Yiddish. We have to go to other libraries other than the Library of Congress to find them, because apparently the Library of Congress does not consider them as part of the national heritage, according to the mission statement. So, in case people think I am on a crusade to knock America, we should also note that the United States is not the only country that displays these traits of its national library. The trait of the suppression of immigrant and minority cultures. The same can be observed in Australia within their database called Trove, in Great Britain with the British Newspaper Archive, in France with the two databases, Gallica and Retro News, and in Austria with ANO, that's ANNO. All of these 5 nations have a rich national collection of digitalized newspapers in publicly accessible databases, though some charge a fee to access all of the services. And they also have a sophisticated and historical immigrant community. And they all practice cultural suppression of minority and immigrant communities. Remember that newspapers is the cultural memory of these communities. Another interesting point is that the Library of Congress, along with 3 large commercial databases, have digitalized thousands of newspapers from the United States and a few other countries. If we just concentrate on the American newspapers, we find that the goal of these 4 databases is to present the cultural heritage of the nation. They have spent money on the digitalization of newspapers from around the cost of digitalizing newspapers is $1 to $2 a page. So a lot of money has been spent. They have spent money for newspapers from 20 very small towns with populations of less than 1,000, and a few towns that no longer even exist. But as we have seen, these efforts have not been extended to the immigrant community. Furthermore, several of these immigrant newspapers have been digitalized, but by foreign agencies. A Welsh newspaper from Utica, New York is at the National Library of Wales. 2 English language newspapers from the Jewish community are uniquely at the National Library of Israel. There's a Dutch newspaper from Paterson, New Jersey, only available at the National Library of the Netherlands. And Finland has some unique American Finnish items as well. And there's probably more that I haven't discovered. Well, therefore, and this is not only a national problem. If we look at the databases of newspapers from states like New York, California, we also see the same phenomena. Also Manitoba and Canada, which is a rich ethnic community, also has no ethnic newspapers. Oh, I should apologize to New York. They have 1 Polish newspaper from Buffalo. That's it. So we'll leave this for contemplation, and we'll go on to take a look at the importance of newspapers, which is a parallel problem, maybe related. Bahá'u'lláh and the importance of newspapers. The practice among Baha'i writers seems to show an ambivalence as to the value of newspaper articles. other than those to be used as a sort of trophy. By that I mean that we often hear of people saying, oh, an article was published in such and such a famous magazine. End of sentence, without any analysis or contemplation of the meaning behind it or who wrote it. This is a reflection of what the trend seems to be in some circles of the academic world, as reflected by an article published by the American History Association by Professor Jerry W. Knudsen, who wrote in 1998. Not until John Bach McMaster's History of the People of the United States began publication in 1883 did any prominent historian in this country make copious use of newspaper quotations. He goes on to say, quote, many historians have consulted newspapers since then, but few have recognized the wider significance of the role of the press in both reflecting and shaping society. At about the same time, or at least during the same decade as McMaster was writing, Bahá'u'lláh wrote about the importance of newspapers as a primary and secondary source of information, a statement which stands well ahead of contemporary thinking about the value of newspapers, as can be seen by Knudsen's statement. Please, Boyd.
Bahá'u'lláh on newspapers and writers. In this day, the mysteries of this earth are unfolded and visible before the eyes, and the pages of swiftly appearing newspapers are indeed the mirror of the world. They display the doings and actions of the different nations. They both illustrate them and cause them to be heard. Newspapers are as a mirror endowed with hearing, sight, and speech. They are a wonderful phenomenon and a great matter. Tarazat, Tablets of Baha'u'lláh revealed after the Kitabi Aqdas. If any man were to arise to defend in his writings the cause of God against its assailants, such a man, however inconsiderable his share, shall be so honored in the world to come that the concourse on high would envy his glory. No pen can depict the loftiness of his station, neither can any tongue describe its splendor. La Isaliman, Gleanings from the Writings of Baha'u'lláh. Blessed, doubly blessed is the pen that hath voiced his praise, the scroll that hath borne the testimony of his writings. Lawiyar-Dibah, Tablets of Baha'u'lláh revealed after the Kitabi Aqdas.
Thank you very much, Boyd. These quotations open up a wide scope of activity for future researchers. Not only is the importance of the missing reports in the ethnic and minority presses mentioned above brought into sharper focus, one could argue that the retrieval of such documents concerning Abdu'l-Bahá verges on that of a sacred trust. And what is the significance of those who wrote in defense of the faith? In 1903, there were terrible persecutions of the Bahá'ís in Persia. Over 130 American newspapers responded by publishing articles. Most of the articles were obtained from wire services, but many editors applied their own headlines to these articles, some with uncanny insight. Quote, pagans kill and torture, from the Bay City Tribune in Michigan, or mobs in Persia slay reformers, from the San Francisco Call. 4 articles were discovered where the editors were calling for petitions to be organized and delivered to the Secretary of State. These were from, 2 were from Yuma, Arizona, 1 from New Orleans, and 1 from Springfield, Massachusetts. There are probably a lot more. Another way these articles protected the faith is revealed by this account from Ahmad Sorab as presented by Amín Egea. Quote, when he, Abdu'l-Bahá, returned to London, Abdu'l-Bahá was invited to a dinner in his honor in the Persian legation. And the ambassador presented him with a collection of clippings from Edinburgh newspapers with articles about him which were provided to the embassy by a clippings bureau. I am sure that the Ottomans did the same, and that the information was sent to Istanbul. Another role that these journalists and publishers did was to proclaim the faith. It was these articles that alerted hundreds of thousands or more of people around the globe to the very existence of a new divine messenger and a new message. These were deliberate actions by the editors, publishers, journalists to proclaim the faith. The only reason they had for including the word Babi or Babism in an article was but that somebody should read it. Here is a list of states of the United States and the dates of the first newspaper coverage, first newspaper article per state. You see that the list is in two parts. The first part is those during the ministry of the Bab and the 10 years after. And the second list is during the ministry of Bahá'u'lláh. So by the end of Bahá'u'llah's life, during his ministry, one can presume that the majority of the literate people in the West at least heard of the existence of the faith. And it's unfortunate that more research hasn't been done on this so that we would be able to know the names of the editors and publishers and writers. As Baha'u'lláh states that they have a station. Perhaps it is appropriate to begin the history of the faith in a given city or region, not with the arrival of the first pioneer or travel teacher, but with the appearance of the first newspaper article. Now, the last document is a list of countries. I think we have it there. Did I attach that, Boyd?
Don't
The list
think
of
so.
countries. Nope. Okay. My bad. Okay.
Well, sorry, that is the oldest discovered publications referencing the faith by current country and territory and city.
That's right. Yep. Okay, it's there.
Coming up.
Yep. And yeah. Okay. So we can see that the whole world knew of the faith during the lifetime of the Bab. Before 1850, we had newspaper coverage as far as Australia, New Zealand, United States, most of Europe. And so that's it for my presentation. I'm opening for questions. Yes, Robert?
Yes, indeed. I'm turning on my camera as well. Thank you very much, Jan. That was really very interesting. And I think it's fascinating to see that so many states had articles about the faith at one time or another. I think you mentioned to me that but during the lifetime of Baha'u'lláh, it was all but 2 states. But can you mention those 2 states that didn't have articles?
Yes, Delaware and New Mexico.
Delaware and New Mexico.
No, but I should say that these are the ones that have been discovered
so far,
and so that they might have had articles, but they have not been. The newspapers have not been discovered or digitalized. I am restricted to my searching.
Right, of course.
And I should mention that the first article discovered from Minnesota was in Swedish. And the first one discovered from New Mexico was in Spanish.
Interesting.
So, and we also have Spanish from Puerto Rico.
One of the things that struck me when I looked at newspapers, 19th century newspapers, was the fact that before there were wire services, it was very common for newspapers, in small places especially, to subscribe to big city newspapers. They'd arrive, of course, by mail a couple days after they had been printed. And then the newspapermen would go through them and would just simply rewrite articles that they found in those newspapers. Today, that would be a massive violation of copyright. But of course, in those days, they didn't enforce copyright. So I assume many of these articles in small towns and such were probably of that sort, were probably shortened or rewritten versions of articles that were published elsewhere.
That's right. And we have to remember that this was not an automatic process where someone hit some keys.
Right.
The editors or journalists, or usually the editor, publisher, and journalist was the same person in some of these small towns.
Right.
Made a conscious decision to take an article about the faith and reinsert it in their newspaper, select a title for it, and add their own title to that article. So active proclamation of the faith by thousands of editors, publishers, journalists around the world before the Baha'is arrived at those places.
Right. Yeah, we've known that the New York Times covered the faith as early as either 1844, I guess it was 1845. So
1845.
That's the example of how early it could be. And it was probably those kinds of articles that then really got wider circulation. And I suspect we will continue to find these articles for a century or so as more and more of them get digitized.
Right. Well, if the virus that we mentioned at the beginning is suppressed with these libraries, and they digitalize the whole of the cultural value of a country rather than being selective with the majority.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a process that obviously has been retarded and needs to be accelerated.
And I think Baha'i scholars have a role to play with this, because they can go to a library and they can say, hey, where is the newspaper from such and such an ethnic group? Why don't I see it here?
Well, part of the difficulties that the Baha'i scholars will have to probably know that language, unless, of course, we're talking about an English language newspaper from that group, and many of them were in English. So,
well, I don't know Swedish or Norwegian or Icelandic or Italian or any of these languages, and I have been able to find these articles. So it's the effort of plucking out the xenophobia virus from your mind, and not thinking it's the other, but it's part of us.
So Jay asked this question, may we have all these slides to review on our own? Are we going to be able to put this Word document up, for example, on our webpage for this talk?
Sure, whatever you want to do with it.
Good, so we'll certainly plan on doing that. We can definitely make it available to people that way. I'm looking to see what other questions we might have.
How is concerns asked today?
Ask?
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
I could hear the conversation as well, and I wasn't sure whether it was something you wanted to comment about or not.
Sorry, what was the comment, Danny?
You talked about what happened in the past, but what happens today?
Yeah.
And how does it concern people today?
The question was, how does it concern us today? Well, two things. One is that currently we are missing these talks from Abdu'l-Bahá. And so we have lost or are losing or are in the process of losing part of our spiritual heritage. and our spiritual memory. And the history of the faith is deprived of these articles. And this process is continuing because as these agencies continue to digitalize the English language papers, they're not digitalizing the immigrant community papers, and the microfilm and the original documents are deteriorating daily.
Right.
So the longer they take to digitalize these newspapers, the more we lose.
Is it possible to digitize a newspaper from a microfilm, or do you have to use the original paper copy?
The preferred way of the Library of Congress now is from microfilm.
Uh-huh.
So maybe, do I have a little bit of time?
Sure. Yeah.
So maybe I should explain the processes of how these newspapers went from the newspaper editorial office to digitalized format, and at the various stages that that decisions had to be made. First, the newspaper was sent to a library, either by purchase or by library or by legal deposits, copyright deposit system. The libraries of Congress should have guaranteed that they were received. This was not always the case for the immigrant newspapers.
Mm-hmm.
Then they had to have a retention policy. Some of these were also sent to state libraries or state historical societies, which also had a quasi-government function. So then there's the retention. How long do you keep them? Many libraries recorded the receipts and put them into the bin. Some of them kept them for a week or 2 or 3 months and then discarded them. Some of them, that's the second step. The next stage was to conserve them. Some libraries conserved them in vermin-free, temperature-controlled environments. Others put them in the attic with the mice, or in the basement with the rats and the leaking pipes. I have seen both. I have seen all three. So, which newspapers do you conserve, and which ones do you put with the mice and the rats? Right? The next decision-making process was to microfilm. At all of these stages, money was involved, or labor money. So the next stage was to microfilm. And we know that this horrendous 1970s microfilm project, the scandal of this, where newspapers were microfilmed in the 70s, the originals were discarded, and there's no quality control for the microfilm.
Mm.
And the ethnic press suffered the most on this. Then there's the process of digitalizing and the type of digitalizing, which is a final one. In each stage, there is a decision to be made. Which newspaper is the most important to do? Which one costs the most? Which one represents the community the most? So obviously, newspapers from Sunbeam, Minnesota, and from place like White Pines, Colorado, have a higher cultural value than newspapers from Hungary or from Portugal, even though nobody lives in those towns. The newspapers exist, but nobody lives there. So, there is some type of problem, either conscious or unconscious. I'm going to be charitable and say this is an unconscious problem, but it's been going on, and that's the situation.
Steve Kolins has been commenting on the chat here that Indeed, there's a kind of structural xenophobia. A kind of structural xenophobia remains when some sources aren't made available. Some universities have been removing paywalls for services in COVID times, but it's not systematic. One thing about today is that the history of communities might be only vague and miss the first members of assemblies and other sort of basic information. The progress of the community, from community to community, we're often left at a vacuum of thinking nothing was ever done in the past. And he says also, it was definitely the case that some writings of the Bab were sent to America, but the collections were not understood and were purged by 1905. So you have these kinds of problems.
Well, I'm glad he mentioned about these private collections. We have basically three types of collections of newspapers. One are the digitalized collections. I'm talking about digitalized collections. One are the ones which are freely available, chronicling America, and from state libraries or state historical societies like New York, Minnesota, California, Texas, etc. Then there are the ones which you have to pay for, like newspaperarchives.com, newspapers.com, Genealogy Bank. But these are still publicly available. You just have to put out some money. Then there are the elitist collections. There are two types of elitist collections. One is the ones where you have to be a resident of a city or a state to be able to go to a library to access that collection. So maybe these are semi-elitist, depending on how you feel about living in that state. Then the truly elitist ones are like the ones from Princeton and Harvard, where you have to be a member of the community, the scholarly community, a professor or a student, to be able to access these. You have JSTOR as a system like that.
Yep.
And some of these are what's the term to use? Very nationalistic in their attitude.
Mm-hmm.
Hathi Trust is very interesting. They say they're international, but the only libraries they have there are American, Canadian, and Australian. And and 2/3 of their collection is elitist because you have to be a member of a university to access it. So, yet they call themselves international. No, I wish some of these agencies would not advertise themselves such, and they would avoid a lot of tomatoes being thrown at them. And so I hope that helps this question.
Sure. We also have two questions in the Q&A. Pilar asks, what can we do nowadays to help keep the memory of our communities alive? And she adds also, what, in your opinion, can the role of blogs and other digital media be to help avoid what has happened in the past with the articles and stories that are now lost?
Well, see, can you repeat the first one?
What can we do nowadays to help keep the memory of our communities alive?
Okay. One thing that is possible is to find, to be lucky enough to live in a city which had a newspaper which published an early article on the faith. Find that article, find out who the editor or the publisher was, and do a bio of him, because he's our hero. And if you do a bio of him for the local history society, for the local history corner of the newspaper, or either internet newspaper or a real newspaper or local history magazine, then he becomes a hero of the community as well as being our hero. and then you have established him, and you have proclaimed the faith, and you have proclaimed this gentleman. And take a look at the second quote, what Bahá'u'lláh says about his status in the next world. So that's one thing we can do. The other thing is that if you find newspapers from minority communities, whatever the language that is, that are not been digitalized, make a mention of it to the librarian.
Yeah,
you know, you don't have to be of that community. You don't have to be a Norwegian to complain about the fact that there are no Norwegian newspapers digitalized in a town which has got a history of Norwegian settlers,
right,
etc. And one thing is that some of this work will mean that people are going to have to go to libraries and get their fingers dirty. So we're actually going to have to go and find the original newspapers, turn the pages, literally get their fingers dirty, and find these articles and photocopy them or whatever, scan them, because they have to be preserved, because the original newspapers are deteriorating.
Yep.
Libraries are losing money, so they don't have money to microfilm or to digitalize. And so it's going to have to be taken upon us to do this. And to some type of coordination on a state or national level is also called for. But how it's going to be done, I have no idea.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember in 1983, I went to Cincinnati to try and find some newspaper articles about the Baha'i community at Cincinnati in 1900. And I managed to find them. I found one, actually. The problem, of course, was that 1983, there was no cell phone, so I couldn't photograph the thing. And the paper was too fragile for me to photocopy it. So I had to hand write out the article. And then, of course, when I quoted from it, I had to convince the publishers that I had caught every comma and every capital letter, because there was no way of checking the my copy to make sure I had copy it exactly right. That was also true of materials I found on Thornton Chase in Colorado. I had to hand copy some of them. Some of that stuff's now been digitized, and you can now actually find them online.
Yeah, or else you can take a hand scanner and you can scan them.
Today, not in 1982.
No, today, but 1982, you could take a camera and take photographs.
Yeah, but I was a poor graduate student. I couldn't afford to do that.
Yes. I remember those days.
Yeah.
Yeah, but now you don't have to wait for digitalization. If you have the original, you can get yourself a hand scanner and scan it. Cell phones sometimes are dodgy, you know.
Well, I used my cell phone. I've used it twice in archives, and it worked reasonably well.
Yeah.
The tricky point then is you've got these huge files that are JPEGs, and then you have to try and convert them into something useful. Steve says, and who gave the talk that was mentioned in the article, but I'm not sure which talk or which article we're referring to here. Steve also mentioned that we're going to have a symposium in April, I think it is, March or April. It's going to be one of these Sunday webinars, where we will have 3 speakers, one covering the history of the Baha'i faith in North Carolina, one covering Missouri, and one covering Kansas, mostly covering the first 50 years or so from the beginning of the 20th century up to the middle of the 20th century, including, I already know that the Kansas and Missouri people are going to include the mention of the first newspapers. So I'm sure you'll be happy to hear about that, Jan.
Yes, I am. And if they need any assistance, they can call upon me.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure they'll be very interested in that. And I suspect Steve is going to be very interested in hearing about the first one in North Carolina if he hasn't seen the one you found, because he's going to be covering the history of the faith in North Carolina. I'm trying to see if we have any other comments or questions. I don't see any right offhand. You mentioned, oh, I do have another one down here now. Hold on. Taher's a day. It's good to hear from him. Says Lotfullah Hakim did exactly the same thing, hand copying all the newspaper articles about the master's visit to Scotland and then typing them all out. I didn't have a chance to type them out, Taher, but it's yes, it's exactly what we had to do in those days. What do you know? Have you done any research about state collections of ethnic newspapers? I gather you nowadays on the web you can find these things.
Yes, I looked at New York, California, Texas, Arizona was the last one I looked at. Minnesota. Minnesota, they have they're the top of the league. They are the top. The Minnesota Historical Society is the top of the league. They have a special project of digitalizing Swedish American newspapers. Now, here is an interesting example of xenophobia at the state level, where the Minnesota people have found and digitalized newspapers in Swedish from California, from New York, from Illinois, where those state libraries have ignored them. Those state libraries had a responsibility of including those, and they did not do so. So here's an interesting domestic example. But we also have a case of tokenism involved in this as well, where, for example, Texas has one black newspaper digitalized, one German newspaper, one Jewish newspaper. So, you know, I think that they're rationalizing it by saying we're representing the communities, but hey, you know, it's tokenism, you know, it's what it is.
And I gather before World War I, German newspapers were the second most common number of newspapers in the United States after English. That's what I think I'd heard.
I've seen the number 1,000 titles.
Yeah, lots and lots.
What speaking about that period of time and up to 1919, 1920, the red years of American history, there was an American government agency for censorship. And most people don't know this. It was called the U.S. Postmaster General's Office. And they suppressed many socialist newspapers to the point that if you go on Wikipedia, on Google, and you look at American socialist newspapers, you will see a whole long list. And after many titles, you'll see this, the phrase "no longer available" or "no issues available." So thank you very much, U.S. Post Office.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, what did they do? Did they refuse to circulate them?
Yep.
So people had to sell them by hand in the big cities, which is a much more difficult.
And the people were prosecuted, and you know they referred them for prosecution for sedition. The editors.
That is interesting. Well, that Red Scare time was almost as bad as McCarthyism, from what I understand.
And so, if Americans say we never had censorship in America at the national level, they're wrong. And speaking about censorship, if I may have a second here, there's a misunderstanding of the role of censorship. Most people think that censorship is to prevent people from reading certain bits and pieces of information. No. The true role of censors is for the writer not to write those thoughts.
That's true.
Okay, that's the true role of censorship. Okay.
Yeah, it tends to suppress imagination and creativity really quite a lot,
Right.
I think. Yeah,
Right.
I think that's very true.
Back to 1984.
Yeah. Well, we're pretty much out of questions at this point.
Okay.
And so I want very much to thank you for your presentation today, which was really quite interesting. Weaving together Bahá'u'lláh, Abdu'l-Bahá, newspaper, xenophobia, and quite a few other related topics. And I think we're not going to have any more webinars, web talks until January. So we will, for those who are following us, you'll be able to find the information, of course, in our various publications, our emails that go out weekly. So I want to thank everyone for watching today, thank them for their questions, and look forward to seeing them again in the next year. Thank you, everyone, and thank you again, Jan.
Thank you, Robert.